Hey everyone, my name is Martin, and in today's video I'll be showing you how to produce Follow by Martin Garrix and Zedd. So let's take a look at the FL Studio session, which you can by the way download for free down below. And we see that I've categorized the production elements into sections. We have the verse instruments, the leads and chord layers, basses, drums, effects, all the way down to some bus and master channel automation clips. So let's begin with the intro, where we hear this really cool arpeggio playing a combination of two notes, F sharp and C sharp. And you might be wondering why these two notes. Well, the key of Follow is B minor, and F sharp is the perfect fifth of B, meaning it's located exactly 7 semitones above B, and C sharp in turn is the perfect fifth of F sharp, and that's why these notes go so well with practically any chord in this B minor song. Now, these chords are mainly played by a piano, for which I'm using the LA Custom Cinematic Patch in Keyscape. And this one has a really warm and cinematic feel to it. And this warmth is then reinforced by the way we voice our chords. So if we take a look at the piano roll, we see that the chords are basically spread over 4 different octaves. And this just gives us a ton of body and warmth, as our notes simply cover a really broad frequency spectrum. Now, speaking of frequencies, I'm mixing the piano with Soothe, which is making the frequencies in the range of like 150 up to 1,500 Hz less harsh. And let's actually turn up this depth knob over here to better hear what this plugin is doing. Actually almost sounds like a filter. Next, I'm using this free plugin called Camel Crusher to add some color and fatness to our piano sound, followed by a multiband compressor from FabFilter, which basically allows us to compress specific parts within the sound's frequency spectrum. And in this case, I'm using the Rich Piano preset, and what this one mainly does is making sure that the range from around 50 up to 500 Hz is ducking or reduced in volume once the volume within this specific range exceeds a certain level. And overall, this instance of Pro MB helps us achieve a tighter and cleaner piano sound. I'm then further cleaning things up using this equalizer, which removes all of the piano sub-information or rumble below 33 Hz, which is inaudible anyway. I then have a subtle cut within the 100 Hz range in order for the piano to sound a bit more clean, which is something you, by the way, don't want to overdo, as that'll easily make your piano or other instruments sound thin or characterless. I also have a small boost at around 1K for that tiny bit of extra brightness. And finally, I've subtly rolled off the high frequencies using the least steep slope out there, which ensures the piano sounds filtered without becoming too dark or losing too much detail in the higher end of the frequency spectrum. And to further emphasize this filter effect, I also have a DJM filter automating throughout the song, which just adds a bit of extra dynamic to the piano as it slowly opens up as we move through the verses. Then all the way at the bottom of our piano's mixer channel, we see this fruity send, which I'm using to duplicate our piano onto a new mixer channel. And on this new channel, I'm applying a reverb that is 100% wet. Now, if you want to learn more about using a so-called reverb send, I definitely recommend you to go check out my other recent Martin Garrix tutorial after you finished watching this video, as that's where I explain reverb sends in more detail. So parallel to this piano, I'm using various other sounds to fill up the space, create more of an atmosphere, and simply complement the piano, like this pluck sound playing a B on every second and fourth beat, which I'm layering with this vocal shot from the Cashmere pack. And the mixing of these two sounds really shows how valuable filters and reverbs can be in shaping atmospheric background layers like these. I'm then actually duplicating this vocal shot and pitching it down to F sharp instead of the initial B, which kind of creates this response to the call of the initial vocal shot. And in a way this also resembles the rhythm of a clock, which I think helps build the suspense and also complements the clock sample introduced in the second half of the verse really nicely. Further, we have the arpeggio I talked about before, for which I'm using silent 1, and specifically I'm using a combination of 3 saw waves with a ton of internal effects like a phaser, a chorus, and especially the built-in arpeggio tool, which ultimately creates this 1/16th rhythm. So I already love the way this arpeggio sounds without any effects, but I still applied some small modifications to have it mold with the track even better. Beginning with this free plugin called Crush, which is a useful tool for bit crushing and distorting, which adds this nice little crust on top of our arpeggio. So after this instance of Crush, I have a DJM filter, which actually rolls off some of the higher frequencies we just artificially created using Crush, but we're still able to hear some of that original crush, which I think is a really nice way to smoothen that initial bit crush effect. Continuing, I have an EQ that cuts out all of the low end and one specific resonance that was quite unpleasant. I then have a stereo enhancer that enriches the sound's stereo image, followed by a reverb with a pretty long decay, which further extends the atmosphere. And finally, there is another DJM filter to act as a low-pass filter, which slowly opens up through an automation clip. Now, another element slowly introduced through a filter automation clip is this set of sustain strings from Session Strings Pro 2, playing a constant C sharp and F sharp over 2 octaves. So you might wonder, do we have enough atmospheric elements by now? And the answer is no, because we're also introducing these 2 vocal samples, respectively playing F sharp and C sharp. And these serve as our final layers of atmosphere and ambience within the verse, complementing the plug, the vocal shots, the arpeggio, and the strings. And then the final melodic element within the verse is this tremolo violin from Session Strings Pro 2, which plays the final notes of the lead melody that we'll talk about in a minute. And this violin just helps us transition into that big lead section. So underneath all these melodic elements, I'm also using this really cool wind sample, as well as a clock sample from the MusicCore Lost Sample Pack, which creates even more tension within the verse. And just like the violin, it acts as a transitional layer that will lead us into the lead section. Now, in this lead section, we are greeted by this ear-catching variation of the drop, which really brings back these old-school electro vibes, which I think is quite refreshing and exciting to hear in 2022. So this section is composed of quite a few layers, and I guess we'll just break them down piece by piece to fully understand the role of each element. So as a first lead layer, we have an instance of silent 1 that is created with 4 saw waves, and while you'll notice that the synth has a lot of saw characteristics to it actually has more of a short decay, resulting in more of a pluck sound, which is emphasized even more by this distortion tool within the synth itself. Now, if we play the dry sound, you'll notice that it actually has a much brighter sound. So in order to match the vibe of the original sound, I've applied a DJM filter to cut out most of the higher frequencies, followed by a DS10 drum shaper to add some more attack and punch, and finally a vintage verb with a decay of 2 seconds to just add some space. Following on to the next sound within our lead, we're using another saw layer in silent 1, which alongside the saw oscillators also has an oscillator dedicated as white noise, which helps add power and some grit to the lead. And this synth is a lot more talkative, and it actually almost sounds like a distorted voice, which we partly achieve using Crush, which adds this really cool downsampled bit crush effect to our layer. And then another fun little thing we're doing here is automating the synth's LFO gain, which creates this cool pitch wobble effect, which Martin Garrix used to apply a lot in his older songs. So to create that effect, we select pitch A and B, we set our LFO rate to around 132, we move this pitch knob slightly above 0, and then we can simply play with the gain knob to determine how much of this crazy effect we actually want to hear. I'm then supporting the lead with 2 chord layers, the first one being a Z type of layer made in Vital, which is a saw with 6 voices and some very minimal detuning. I further adjusted the ADSR envelopes and especially the decay to slightly under 1 second, and then I added a filter with 0 resonance, and I linked this macro knob to the filter's cutoff knob, which opens up the filter every time we play a note. And finally I added some internal multiband compression to make it sound way tighter and cleaner, which is something I then further emphasize using an instance of OTT on the mixer, which simply helps accentuate the higher frequencies in a really energetic way. Then the second chord layer is there to support the Zedd synth, as it helps bring body and completeness to our chords, and it's actually just a really simple detuned saw synth. And if we hear it without any effects, it sounds kind of dull and dark, which is why I've applied some compression, which brings the chord melody more forward, followed by an OTT, which really adds a lot more sparkle to our sound. There's also a sound goodizer that pushes the synth's highs even further. And lastly, I'm using a vintage verb to subtly bring out dimension and some more atmosphere. So we talked about our lead and the chord synths, and now we only got the bass section left to cover as a part of the overall lead section. So for the basses, we're going to be using 2 layers, both created in Sylenth 1. For the first layer, we're using an acid bass that mainly consists of a saw as well as a sine wave oscillator. However, we're also applying quite a lot of resonance within the sound's filter control section, which causes the bass to sound really dirty and acid-like, which is also a result of this overdrive distortion tool and these filter cutoff and resonance modulation envelopes and LFO. Then in terms of mixing, I have an EQ that cuts away most of the lows. And I'm also applying this mid-side band at 150 Hz to ensure that all sound below that range is kept in the sender or mono. I've also added a stereo shaper to make the bass wider. And this kind of makes this acid bass wrap around our other bass layer. So this other bass layer, which I call Zedd bass, is composed of a saw, a sine, a square, and a white noise oscillator, which makes for a very interesting combination of sound sources. And I've then applied some heavy bit crushing, which simply makes our sound a lot more aggressive. But then I still wanted the bass to be a lot fatter, for which I'm using my beloved Crush, followed by a simple low-cut EQ, and finally a high-pass filter that is only enabled in the build-ups using this automation clip. So in the build-up, we're using a few of the layers we just discussed, except that the chord layers are now playing a variation of the lead melody that is a few semitones higher, and makes for a very nice variation, because after this build-up, our melody is returning to the already familiar lead melody. Then some other elements in the build-up are this ride sample playing on every beat, this snare roll that is slowly becoming more present through this filter automation clip, and that is also being pitched up using this pitch bend automation clip over here. And finally there's these snare samples that together form this fill that marks the end of the build-up and the beginning of the drop. Now in this drop, alongside the layers we discussed before, we're introducing this clap attack layer to really just bring out the transients of the melody and to add some extra power. And crucially, we're also introducing a sub bass, which comes from Sublab, my favorite plugin for 808s and sub basses. And this one just adds a lot of warmth and fatness to the lower part of the frequency spectrum, especially because of this instance of R bass, which beautifully brings out some of the sub's harmonics. Oh, and by the way, I almost forgot to talk about the tape stop effect, but I'm routing most of the sounds in the drop to this tape stop bus over here, where I'm using D-Blue Glitch, and this is a free plugin for creating tape stop effects, which sounds like this. Then taking a closer look at the drums and effects, I'm using this Dirty South kick that I sampled a long time ago, which is a really clean kick with a ton of punch, which also meant that it did not require much tweaking besides some compression. And this really helped solidify our kick's placement within the mix, offering just the right amount of punch and mitigating some of that heavy bloating low end. Now another thing I did to make the kick sound less bloated was applying this volume automation clip, which practically shapes the kick's decay and release. And this makes our kick a lot shorter while still maintaining that punch, which in turn leaves a lot more space for the other bass elements that would otherwise clash with the kick's decay and release because they contain a lot of low frequencies. So alongside the kick, you'll notice that there's also a clap playing during the drop, which is the same clap as the one we hear during the verse lead section, and this one just adds a lot of energy to the drop, as you'll be able to hear when I A-B this sample. Now, speaking of energy, you may also notice these white noise and exhaust samples that play on each beat along with the clap, which adds even more power to our drop. So in a high energy drop like this one, it's really all these small details and effects that make such a huge impact and difference. So definitely make sure to not overlook these elements when you're creating your own high power drops. Then halfway in the drop we hear this fill, which is used at several other points within this remake, which helps the drop transition into its second half, which is where we're introducing this cool snare pattern for some extra rhythm and to keep things interesting, to then head into the second verse. And this second verse is very similar to the first verse, except that we're now introducing this vocal chop, which I created in Fruity Slicer using Dua Lipa's vocals. And I've then applied quite a lot of processing in order to make it sound closer to the original sound. So I have an instance of decapitator to bring the sound more forward, a DJM filter to cut out most of the higher frequencies, a little alto boy which pitches the sound up by 1 octave while leaving the sound's formant intact so it doesn't end up sounding like a chipmunk. Then we're using a PSP vintage warmer to add this overwhelming amount of saturation and body, and immediately after that I have an EQ that cuts away most of the unpleasant frequencies caused by this overwhelming amount of distortion. And then I wanted to hide even more of the vocal's high frequencies, which is why I'm using another instance of DJM filter. And finally, the most important part of this chain, in my opinion, is this reverb, which has a huge decay of 7 seconds and transforms a simple vocal chop like this into something much more atmospheric and ambient. Now, given that there's barely new things happening in the second verse, the second build-up, and the second drop, there's only the outro left for me to discuss. So in the outro, on top of repeating all these common elements from the verses, we are introducing these session strings, playing the chords that just continue to increase their velocities as the melody progresses, which I think is a beautiful way to end this amazing song. So with that being said, I think we've covered most of the important elements in this session, and the final thing I want to discuss with you is my master chain. So I start with an SSL compressor by Waves, which helps glue everything together by adding a tad more punch to the overall mix. I'm also applying Gullfuzz, which is a plugin that uses artificial intelligence in order to basically scan the overall mix and then somehow make it sound better and more pleasant to your ears, which I think is really helpful. Then there's an instance of Endless Smile by Dada Life, which is only being enabled in the build-ups, as this plugin basically increases the tension as you turn up this knob. And in a similar fashion, I'm also automating the volume throughout the song using this instance of Fruity Balance in order to make sure that the verses and the build-ups are slightly less loud than the drops, which in turn makes the drops hit harder. And finally, as always, I'm using Invisible Limiter for adding some extra gain. And that pretty much wraps up this production breakdown. I really hope you were able to take away some tips that you can now hopefully apply within your own productions. Also, I'd recommend you to go download and study the free FLP, the Silent One presets, and the MIDI files down below. Now, if you want to see more breakdowns and remakes like this one in the future, be sure to hit the subscribe button and to click the bell icon. And also always feel free to send me a message on Instagram to say hi. Thank you so much for watching and see you next time.